Do you think there's any world in which China would sign off on this?
No, I don't. I don't think there's any world in which China will sign off on this for exactly the reasons that we just heard. The algorithm is a secret sauce for TikTok. And it's also, from the Chinese point of view, a slippery slope. If the U.S. can force divestiture of TikTok, what else can it do to Chinese business interests in the United States?
What's a bigger threat to this actually happening? The concerns about constitutional rights, freedom of speech, or the amount of time that's been allotted, this arbitrary 6 months to sell a company? Because this is going into a protracted legal fight one way or the other.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I think we're in new territory. I think what concerns many observers is the fact that this is calling out a specific company and a specific set of countries. And so it's very different than what the U.S. usually does. I think that we are entering into unprecedented territory. And I was actually surprised it wasn't more pushback in the House, although I think we will see pushback on constitutional grounds when it goes to the floor of the Senate.
Well, we've already heard some senators voicing those concerns about constitutionality, also voicing concerns about precedent, the idea that potentially another country could look at what the U.S. would do in this hypothetical scenario and try to force that on a U.S. company. I know you say that China would be worried about what this would mean for other Chinese companies doing business in the U.S., but what could this potentially mean for U.S. companies that do business in China? Couldn't this go both ways?
Oh, absolutely. This is putting American companies right in the crosshairs. And there are already rules in China that separate American companies from, for example, Chinese data that's in the cloud. So they already have data protections that we don't have in the United States. But the Chinese, of course, could retaliate in a number of ways to make business more difficult and less profitable for American companies, and even in some cases, force American companies to sell their interests in their Chinese affiliates. So I think a lot of different retaliatory moves would be on the table here, and many would view the Chinese as justified in retaliating here. So I think that the whole world's watching this and seeing, where do we go from here? And it's unlikely that we're going to go anyplace good for international business.
Mary, we spoke with earlier today on Bloomberg FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. He was on Bloomberg Surveillance, talked about the future of TikTok. Listen to what he said.
This plainly is a conduct law, meaning we're acting because of the demonstrated malign national security threat of TikTok, not because of the content of anybody's speech. And the bill is narrowly tailored, which is key for First Amendment analysis, because it simply requires divestment, meaning the millions of Americans that love TikTok, I'm not one of them, but they can continue to use the application, but just in a more secure way.
Wouldn't they also still be able to use the application in the old-fashioned way if this is somehow passed and TikTok is banned? Everybody under 40 is going to get on a VPN and still find TikTok, right?
Yes, we would act more like our friends in China, many of whom are using VPNs. I really don't see the arguments here. We have seen repeatedly arguments that somehow content on TikTok is different. There's more pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli type of content. There's other forms of content that are viewed to be skewed in the direction of policies espoused by the Chinese government. None of that seems very convincing to me. Of course, there's always possibility of, confidential information that's been given to individual Congress people that we are not privy to. But just on the basis of the information that we have been given, I just don't see the danger that is being outlined here. I do see a danger from maligning content. We just saw today threats to young people from apps like Discord. However, what we need is broader legislation that protects Americans' privacy rights, data protections, and also provides guidance to these companies as to how they are to moderate content. So this bill is going to allow legislatures to look like they're doing something to protect American data and American privacy. But in fact, I think they're falling short in both of those areas. The risk is, of course, not so much about this individual company, but about what it says about the larger regulatory environment in the United States and what it will mean for U.S. affiliates abroad.
Well, and of course, this is not the only action we have seen the U.S. take or consider taking in the name of national security as it relates to China. There are also export restrictions to consider, for example, tariffs that are still in place for many goods that have existed since the Trump administration. This comes against a backdrop of a lot of tension, if you will, economically and technology-wise between these two countries. Mary, do you see that improving anytime soon, especially when the Congress is considering legislation like this?
No, and definitely not before the election. We don't see it improving. We also see some, I think, very scary and destabilizing proposals from former President Trump on the campaign route that would suggest even greater action by the U.S. to decouple from China. There has been no move to reduce tensions in areas that are not in critical sectors. Why do we still have tariffs on tablecloths and other types of non-critical goods? There's been really very little attempt to de-escalate here. And that concerns me because we know that there's a potential for much more costly types of conflict. Not only that would affect U.S. businesses, but obviously affect U.S. military operations and other issues in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think that there's a lot of concern about the election year rhetoric. We're hoping a lot of that is simply rhetoric, and that we can begin to say these are real issues of national security concern. And I have to admit, there are many who think TikTok is in that basket, even though I do not. And these are other areas in which we don't see a national security concern. I think it's time that we had that kind of balance, because China just simply isn't going away. It's a major player in the global economy.